Hi everyone, my name is Sam Zlotnik, and I'm going to talk to you today about how morphological plasticity, but not social behavior, may maintain diet breadth in leaf-footed bugs. First, I'd like to thank all of my lab mates, especially the undergraduate researchers who have helped with this project, as well as our funding sources. Now, we're all aware that some animals have highly generalist diets and can feed on a wide range of prey animals and host plants. For example, raccoons are generalist omnivores. These tree frogs here eat a range of invertebrate and vertebrate prey, and these leaf-footed bugs can feed on fruits from dozens of different plant families. That leads us to question how these generalist feeders manage to overcome the diverse range of physical, chemical, and behavioral defenses used by their host or prey species. Our research focuses this question on the case of herbivorous insects, which are often of particular concern in agriculture and food production. While research on plant-insect interactions often considers chemical defenses in plants, there have been fewer investigations into the strategies used by generalist herbivores to overcome a wide range of structural barriers in plants, such as the shells of nuts. For this presentation, I will describe a series of 3 experiments that focus on testing 2 potential strategies for overcoming these barriers: plasticity in feeding morphology, and social feeding behavior. Our study system for this project was the western leaf-footed bug, Leptoglossus zonatus, which is an introduced species in the southeastern United States and can be damaging to many agricultural crops, such as citrus, nuts, pomegranates, corn, and more. These bugs feed by inserting their rostrum, which is a complex of piercing, sucking mouthparts, through any structural barriers such as rinds or shells to get to the food inside. So for this first experiment, we wanted to test whether Leptoglossus zonatus has any degree of developmental plasticity in the total length of their rostrum, which is the main trait determining their maximum depth of penetration into a fruit or nut. To do this, we created agar plates with sunflower seeds embedded either just below the surface or 10 millimeters below the surface, therefore creating either a thin or a thick barrier to feeding. We raised juvenile bugs, called nymphs, through their 4th and 5th instar stages on these diets, and then froze them once they eclosed as adults. The adult bugs were then photographed, and we measured their pronotum width, which is a measure of body size, and their total rostrum length. This figure will show the results of these measurements, with the pronotum width on the x-axis and the rostrum length on the y-axis. As you can see from the regression lines, the bugs raised on the thick barrier diet had longer rostrums relative to their body size than the bugs raised on the thin barrier diet. Additionally, the thick barrier diet limited the survival and body size of the bugs. Therefore, these differences in relative rostrum length between diet treatments may be partially due to differential mortality rather than solely to developmental plasticity. However, at any given body size, the bugs from the thick barrier diet had longer rostrums than those from the thin barrier diet, making it likely that plasticity played a role in their overall rostrum development. Overall, this first experiment indicates that developmental plasticity in feeding morphology may be one mechanism through which juvenile leaf-footed bugs manage to feed through thick structural barriers. We will now turn to 2 studies investigating social feeding behavior to see whether juveniles use behavioral strategies for overcoming these barriers as well. First, we ran a simple observational study to determine whether nymphs reuse the feeding sites of adults to take advantage of the puncture hole created by the larger adult rostrum. We allowed an adult bug to feed on a pecan for up to an hour, and then removed the bug and marked its feeding location. Then we placed a nymph on the nut and watched it for 2 hours to see where it chose to feed. Our results are still preliminary, as we have so far only observed 8 nymphs feeding. Of these 8 nymphs, none chose to feed in the same location as the adult, indicating that they do not use the strategy of reusing feeding sites in order to access nutrients through the thick pecan shell. To follow up on this behavioral study, we decided to experimentally test how adults impact nymph feeding success. We hypothesized that the presence of an adult could help juveniles feed through a thick barrier such as a pecan shell by creating deep and stable punctures in the shell. Therefore, adults might help nymphs survive on a diet with thick barriers and thus lessen the mortality differences we observed in our first experiment. To test this prediction, we raised bugs in plastic cups with a single pecan as a food source, either with or without a shell, and with a single conspecific, either an adult or another nymph. This figure will show the survival differences among treatments, with the x-axis depicting the number of days since the bugs became second instars, which is the developmental stage at which they begin feeding, and the y-axis depicting the proportion of bugs surviving. As we can see, the nymphs feeding on pecans with shells, shown in yellow, had lower survival during their second and third instar stages than the nymphs feeding on pecans without shells, shown in purple. However, the presence of an adult did not ameliorate the effect of the shell, indicating that adult feeding does not make it easier for nymphs to access nutrients inside the pecan shell. Overall, this series of experiments suggests that mouthpart plasticity may facilitate feeding and be an important factor in maintaining diet breadth in Leptoglossus zonatus. However, there is no evidence that social feeding behavior is the strategy used by juvenile Leptoglossus zonatus to feed through structural barriers. And lastly, our survival analyses make it clear that structural barriers surrounding fruits and seeds can seriously limit the survival of even highly generalist feeding insect species. Thank you for listening to my presentation.